On this special episode of Shake, Rattle, and Roleplay, you're invited to the wrap party for our recent campaign of Monsterhearts. My name is Colin.
And I'm Megan. We're going to take a look under the hood of a campaign in detail to find out what worked, what didn't, and what tricks you can steal for your own game.
All this in a special installment of our regular segment on inspirations. So take a seat at the table.
Grab your dice.
Shake, rattle, and roleplay. Hi, on this episode we're going to be talking with Megan's and my other group about a game that we just finished of Monsterhearts. This is the first campaign game of Monsterhearts that we've run, but in order to do that, we're going to need the help of some of the members of our other group.
So you'll notice this podcast is a little different from most of them because we're missing Bill. And the reason for that is a while ago he started running an online game for his and my friends back in Kingston, and I got really bored on Mondays and decided I was going to start a second group and hauled Colin along. And so we've been playing together since
I believe
about a year.
Yeah, it was like February last year or so.
Yep, so we've been playing together for just over a year. Yeah, so we have 2 out of 3 other players than Colin and I here today. And we're going to hear a little bit about them. So we have Melissa and we have Heather. So who wants to go first in telling us about themselves?
Hi, I'm Heather. Thank you for having me. I am a historian by training and new to gaming. I don't really know what to say about myself, but I can tell you that I am a big fan of Bob's Burgers. And
everyone should be.
Everyone should be.
Yes.
One of my favorite blogs is Hyperbole and a Half, which I think everyone should read.
I agree.
My favorite comedian is Rob Delaney, and you can follow him on Twitter at Rob Delaney. When I'm not reading into American history, I'm passionate about big cats, especially tigers.
And what about you, Melissa?
Well, so I am a librarian by training. I work actually with Heather at a youth mental health nonprofit in London. And I've been there for about 2 years. And we started working together actually after we started gaming together, which is interesting. I got into gaming 3 or 4 years ago through my boyfriend. I kind of always wanted to play and just didn't find anybody who would. Similar to you, Megan, where people would talk about it but no one would play with me.
Yeah, exactly. Very similar.
Yeah. Surprisingly common, actually. So we started playing D&D. So we played 4th edition. I played some 3.5. Monsterhearts being probably like my favorite game system. PTA, and we're starting a drama system game soon, so that should be exciting.
I think the first game the 3, Melissa, Megan, and I played together was a Firefly game that Bill ran.
That's right.
That's right, at the con, yeah.
A long time ago, probably 2 years ago, actually.
Yeah.
And then I ran a Fate game at last year's Strength Dex Con that you played in. You and Stu both played in.
Yeah, and then shortly after that, sort of as we were forming this group, I ran a Monsterhearts game, just a one-shot at a con, and that was the first time you'd ever role-played, right, Heather?
My first ever role-playing experience was a one-shot Monsterhearts game with everyone who's on this podcast.
Yeah.
Including Bill.
Including Bill, that's right. He was in that one. So what was it like having Monsterhearts as your first playing experience?
I think it actually helped bring me into gaming. I think that if I had played something that was a little bit more technical or a little bit more maybe numbers heavy, something like Dungeons and Dragons, I don't know that I would have been inspired to keep going. I think that the kind of drama and storytelling and the dynamic between all of the group players made it a really good experience. And it was very dramatic, and it was very fun to play with everyone. So,
if I can embarrass you, I think you did a really good job considering that was your first time out from not shying away from difficult content.
Well, thank you.
It was awesome.
Yeah, so you'd played the Fae in that game. Melissa, you played the Witch in that one. Colin played the Ghoul.
Yes.
And I think we also had
and
the
the
Queen.
Ghoul and the Witch were together. The Witch had brought the Ghoul back to life, and it had gone wrong.
That's right. That's why you were a Ghoul.
And I had been murdered by Bill's character, who was the Queen.
He was the Queen, right. And Amanda, who was on our Tiancha episode, she was playing the Mortal. So, I mean, pretty much everyone in that game either was already or is now sort of in one of our long-term groups. So it was a really fun group to kind of take this first crack at Monsterhearts as a game together.
Yeah. We should probably introduce what Monsterhearts is as a game, but before we do that, I got one question for you guys. So we ask every guest that comes on the show, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being player every time. That's where you want to be, it's where you're comfortable, it's where you're happy. 10 being the other extreme. Always a GM, you don't want to be a player. Where do you see yourself on that scale?
Well, right now I'm probably like a 3.
Okay.
But I've only recently started GMing. I really enjoy it, so I think I would move more towards GMing, but I think it would always be kind of a one or the other kind of thing. I think I'd probably even out like a 5.
Cool. What about you, Heather?
I am definitely a 1. I'm new to role-playing, and I enjoy just sort of being part of the story. I don't think I'm at a place where I would want to run the story. I kind of like being the character and coming up with a character and working with the rest of the people in the group to tell the story. And I'm happy there. I'm happy with sort of being in that role.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I was sort of there forever, and I think I started GMing because Bill finally goaded me into it. And I like GMing, but I still don't get the high from it that I do as a player. I still think I'm more a player than a GM.
Yeah.
You take a rattled mane and hide it in rough terrain through an Avery
What's the tagline on the book, Heather?
This is Monsterhearts, a story game about the messy lives of teenage monsters.
Right. So this is a game that is very much in the teenage supernatural romance genre. That's about exploring teenage sexuality, body issues, feeling monstrous, the horrible things that teenagers do to each other. Do you think that's a good summary, Megan?
Yeah, I think it's very much, I mean, obviously it does borrow a lot from Buffy, but the primary thing it does is sort of the idea of being a monster and certain kinds of monster as metaphors for different kinds of teenage angst.
Yeah, so this game uses skins, which in another game might be classes, but in this case, what a skin would be like a witch or a selkie, a unicorn,
An infernal.
An infernal.
Yeah, we should say it's an apocalypse world hack
Yes.
or variant.
Yes, and should give the author their due. The author is Avery Alder, but you may see the game published under Joe.
Right.
Yeah, skins are different supernatural archetypes or human archetypes that you tend to see in this type of fiction that have unique rules called moves that are applied for only them. That are things like the witch can put curses on people, the infernal character can make deals with demons in order to get things, but most of those moves are things that shape the character's themes and the way other characters interact with that character's themes in ways that are meaningfully different from what you'd see in traditional games where a character has a power that they use that is like, if you're playing a werewolf, you turn into a werewolf and you get a bunch of stat bonuses. In this game, you turn into a werewolf and you lose control of yourself.
Yeah, they're all about ways that essentially, as a teenager, you feel alienated from everyone around you. I mean, there are things you can do that are often supernatural, but they're there as much to sort of hit those issues of feeling like you're a monster and unlovable and, an outsider, which most teenagers go through in one way or another without necessarily, being able to wither them.
Yeah, all of the skins are metaphorical to some kind of actual issue that a teenager would go through, and oftentimes more than one lens can be applied to them to sort of see that issue through different lights.
I think I was surprised because I had first played Monsterhearts a couple times as a one-shot. I was a little skeptical at how long a campaign would go. I think in my head I was like, yeah, maybe 3 episodes. Like, yeah, it's fun. I love Monsterhearts, but can this really be long-term? And I was certainly surprised by how long this game went and sort of how rich it became. So do we want to talk about the characters we played? Just give you a little idea of how the game went. So who wants to start? Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Okay, so the skin I played was the Infernal, and the idea of the Infernal is that you make deals with the demon. The way it works mechanically is you make up to 5 deals with the demon, or essentially, once the demon has 5 strings on you.
So strings are,
Yes.
This is an important concept, so let's dwell on this a minute. Strings represent emotional leverage or feelings that one character has over another. So it might represent knowledge that somebody has about somebody else. It might represent knowing that somebody is attracted to you. And you can, generally speaking, use these things to have certain mechanical effects.
Right.
In
So with the Infernal,
space,
once the demon has 5 strings on me, then essentially it starts calling in the deals it's made, and I can't make any more deals until I've done 5 things for the demon. And so to me, the way I looked at that entire skin was that it was sort of a model for drug addiction, right? That you play someone who's on top of the world while she's making deals, she feels powerful, she's, in my case, she was very manipulative, and then when the demon starts calling it in, it's essentially going through withdrawal. And so it's very much a skin where a lot of the darkest moves sometimes make you more powerful. The Infernal's sort of interesting in that it's a darkest move that makes you very vulnerable, which was something that was appealing to me to play. So in my case, my actual character, her name was Micah. She was, like all of us, a teenager in our small Ontario high school with a fairly young teacher, because that will become important. She always sat at the back of the classroom, and she was really snarky all the time to everybody. And she kind of became increasingly manipulative as the game went on. Which was fun to do in a lot of ways. I've talked before about how I sort of tend to do patterns of characters, and this was one of a couple of dark characters I've played in the last year. She was dark in a very different way from my Tiantia character, and what she really ended up doing a lot of the time was using sexuality as a blunt weapon, in that she wasn't, doing this with any sort of finesse. Colin, you had a really great description for how she did this at one point, because she did this over and over.
What Micah would do was she would point out their vulnerability or the way they had no control over their lives, and then apply herself to them like a bandage. And just when they were starting to feel better, just when they were starting to heal up, she would rip herself off of them, leaving that wound open, so she could come back and continue to do
Right.
that.
So in a way, it's a little bit like taking that drug addict metaphor and even applying it to her relationships, which I really liked. I thought that was accurate too. So yeah, the woman she ended up in a relationship with, the other girl at high school named Nadia, she very much did that too. She manipulated her into feeling bad about herself, and then they started a relationship. And then later she did the same thing to the teacher. She and Nadia together cornered the teacher, made him feel horrible about his life by revealing that his husband was having an affair with another student, and seduced him. And then, interestingly, when I went into my darkest self and became really, really vulnerable, I then used that as a manipulative thing, because I went after Heather's character and essentially threw myself on your mercy and said, "Oh my god, I'm so vulnerable. Please help me."
And it was in my character's nature to not turn you away, though I should have. Well,
Maybe not. And yeah, and eventually I seduced your character and then sort of turned on you a bit. And what was really fun about Micah is we went into the end game, and we'll talk about growing up moves, but I sort of rejected a lot of those and went, yeah, no, screw it. I'm going to become the big bad guy at the end. So at the very last episode of the game, Micah ended up in a showdown with her own demon and managed to wrest control of the power away from him, and thereby made herself the demon for all future teenagers in this town to make very bad deals with. Yeah, I went for broke at the end, and I really thought you guys were going to kill me before I could do that.
You went from being the junkie to being the dealer.
Yeah,
at the
yeah,
end.
exactly.
And you kind of tricked me into helping you, to be
Yeah.
completely honest.
Yep.
It was this last scene, and there's this great fight, and and then my character walks in and sees Micah being attacked, and is like, I'm gonna step in and try to save her, and what she gets is helping her take over a demon's power, which
Yeah.
is not what she had in mind at all.
but I think also you were too powerful for us to take you down without getting your help. I think is part of the other. My character was not strong enough to complete the fight in the way it needed to be completed
Yeah.
to be safe. We had to side with you.
Yeah, and I was also a little bit manipulative there, in that I set up, at the end, I had to sacrifice someone. And so the person I went after initially to sacrifice was like this horrible person who probably deserved to die. And you all agreed this guy needed to die. So suddenly, if I slit his throat in this horrible blood ritual, that doesn't really seem that bad, almost.
It's worth noting with this character that there were 2 dark powers in this game.
Yeah.
One of whom was the teacher's husband, who was
Yeah.
a witch. The other was Micah's dark power. And for a long time, it wasn't really clear who was going to be the big bad. In the end, we used Micah and her connection to her big bad to take out the other one.
Yeah. Yeah, and so then I killed him, and you were all sort of fine with that. And then, essentially, at the point at which you really couldn't do anything to stop me, then I sacrificed somebody innocent as well to complete the ritual. And by that point, it was almost too late to stop me. So, yeah, I became and was pretty much a horrible person through this whole game. And I had so much fun playing her.
Nobody really identified what was happening with you until it was too late.
Yeah, exactly. And I sort of set that up very deliberately to make it look like I was doing things from pure motives. And I wasn't, which honestly you guys should have expected by that point in the game, I have to say, but you know.
I have to say, okay, Gwen never would have expected that.
No, it's true. It's true.
Well, so let's transition characters. Why wouldn't Gwen have expected
Sure.
that?
Okay,
Who was Gwen?
So Gwen is a Selkie. So the Selkie's mostly playing on the idea of like the fish out of water, doesn't really understand people or emotions, and it all kind of plays on that. A lot of the moves are you'll get bonuses if you misinterpret something.
We sort of played her as an exchange student who was coming in from, claiming to have come from France.
Yes, claiming to, but having no knowledge of French.
Or France,
Or France, or really anything. She had a very loose idea of like coastal and then not. It was very confusing. Gwen was this very kind of character who didn't quite understand how things worked. She was very much about being involved with multiple people and didn't really see a problem with it, especially when her partners would say, oh yeah, it's fine, and didn't mean it, because, teenagers don't always say what they mean. But she would always take it as just, yeah, of course they don't mind. They told me they didn't mind. And she would just be very straightforward and kind of make situations more awkward by being that kind of straightforward person.
Yeah, just why wouldn't I sleep with everyone? I want to, they want to. What's the problem
and
here?
And my existing partner said she was fine with it.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
She must be fine with it.
People have no reason to lie.
Yeah. So the Selkie has a couple of things important around her. She has a pelt, which has been taken from her.
Yes. So the Selkie starts out having a pelt, and I think the mechanical thing that works is that anytime whoever has your pelt can ask you to do things, and if you're trying to achieve that goal, you get a +1. So it just kind of encourages you to keep trying to get it back, but they actually have no reason to give it back. There's no and then you complete it, they have to give it back to you.
And it's sort of a feature, not a bug. It's supposed to be that you never really get your pelt back.
Yes, is that you're constantly being kind of manipulated because no one understands you don't understand them, and you keep thinking things are going to change, and they don't, which is interesting. So we started the game. Gwen came to this small town, met some people, fell in love with Rory, Heather's character, but also was involved with Minako, who is a character that Megan played fantastically, and the two of them fighting was amazing. Watching them fight over Gwen was great.
That was a fun NPC to play.
So, I mean, it was kind of interesting because kind of the two big relationships for Gwen, at least, were Minako and Rory. And Minako was very much like, let's explore together. Let's see what happens. I'm willing to share and play, and was very easygoing about it. And Rory, on the other hand, was very like, well, this doesn't feel right to me, and I've made a commitment. And, I mean, you can talk more about that, Heather, but...
There is one other important connection that Gwen had, which was to the player who isn't with us today, the witch, Vanessa.
Yes. Vanessa and I were living in the same house when the game started.
Yes. And a lot of misunderstandings happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was, at one point, got kicked out of the house and was trying to find a place to live.
She killed your goldfish.
She killed my goldfish.
She did, horribly. So yeah, talk about that thing about, because that's again one of the Selkie moves that makes it unique, was about the ocean not understanding either.
Right. So the game kind of has this interesting mechanic where you roll 2d6 and you add them to your bonus, pretty standard. And if you roll a certain number, things happen in certain ways. So this move specifically, if you roll a 10 and up, the ocean gives you something, and it's something helpful, and you're happy, right? But a 10 is not necessarily easy to get. So I think every time I rolled this, I got like a 7, which means that there's complications, and I think every time the ocean like took something from someone else or attacked somebody. There was a scene like where my character was trying to have like an orgy kind of on the beach. Why not? And it got interrupted, and she was sitting on the beach feeling really sad about it, and then the ocean's like, oh, you feel really bad? Well, just kill those people who stopped you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is kind of complicates
the
game quite a bit.
And it's worth noting with this particular move, there's no intentionality behind it. It's triggered by you feel homesick or alone or isolated.
Right. And then I basically picked the move because I was like, you know what? This is an interesting way to move the plot forward, and it basically gives the GM free reign to
Right.
do interesting things.
And so, yeah, you were sitting on the beach feeling sorry for yourself, and the ocean decides to help you by killing the witch and her boyfriend.
Or trying to.
Trying to, and
Yeah.
then start putting in motion a giant chain of
She blamed
I hurt
you.
you first, you hurt me, back and forth,
Yeah.
trying to damage each
Yeah,
other.
because she thought you'd done it on purpose, and the witch was determined that you'd done it on purpose, and you're like, well, I had no idea. I didn't ask for this to happen, and it just became a long chain of events.
Yeah.
And eventually your brother showed up.
He did.
Yeah. So
Or
your
my
brother,
dog.
my dog, showed up, and who's just as out of water as Gwen is, came to land and said, you know, the ocean's being even more destructive down there than it is up here because it wants you to come home. You have to come back. Ultimately putting Gwen in the position of having to decide, am I going to stay here or am I going to go home?
And with the sulky skin, again, it's a feature of that particular skin that if you go home, you can never come back to land.
Yep.
So it's sort of that moment of whether you pick whether you're irrevocably leaving your past behind or you are going back to what you knew and never having anything different.
And I mean, at the end of this, Colin kind of forced me into making the decision forever by kind of the last scene being me giving my pelt to my brother and him taking it back as kind of appeasement to what was below. So it wasn't even like, I can put off going back. Maybe I'll go back in a year or two. It was a decision that she had to live with.
Yeah.
But I think you made the right decision.
And it was very sweet because we had sort of this lovely love story between two of our characters, and that's part of Heather's story. So Heather, who are you playing?
Yes, I played the unicorn skin, and my character was named Aurora, or Rory for short. And the unicorn is this kind of... She's very different from a lot of the other characters. She's a very sort of timid, gentle, naive kind of character. And her kind of power is, I guess in some ways, sort of counteracting or attempting to counteract sort of the malicious behavior of her peers, or at least that's the way she sees it. The flip side of her personality is that she's a little bit self-righteous and a little bit holier than thou, and
A little bit?
mostly entirely self-righteous and holier than thou, actually, because the moves are sort of, you know, you roll with integrity, and
You sort of have to pick some values that you
have to-
will not or do not want to cross, or there are consequences if you
Yes.
right.
act counter to that.
And like, in addition to that, you're probably going to judge other people that do cross those lines.
Right. So, yes, there's a very kind of feeling like you're operating from the moral high ground, and being the really judgy kid in the class that is very offended, for example, was very, very scandalized by the idea that someone had spiked the punch at the school dance.
Yes.
That was Micah.
and that the teacher who was young was like telling you like, you should have a drink with your friend. I'm turning a blind eye to this. Like, you're a teenager. Enjoy being a teenager. I'm not seeing what you're doing.
Right. So, yes, he was very like, you need to chill out and it's not a big deal, and I was very upset by that.
Yeah.
And then later
Even though he's saying to you, like, you know, I trust that you're not going to take this too far. You're not one of those kids.
Yeah. And then later that same evening, you were really scandalized because Micah was trying to seduce Rory. The first time, you, like, completely pushed me away.
Yeah, so a lot of the character arc is kind of being scandalized, and then navigating how you're going to continue interacting with your friends if they behave in a sort of a way that's a little bit more middle of the road and normal. So and Rory is also coming from kind of a traumatic background, so the kind of push for the character from the skin, the kind of guidance from the skin is that magic is dying. So Rory has sort of left her unicorn family. This is how I developed the character. She kind of left her unicorn family and was living by herself, and she's kind of on the fringes of whether she'll live with humans or kind of live on her own, and how difficult it is to navigate feeling socially isolated, while also, you know, not really wanting to partake in what are usually seen as traditional teenage activities like drinking and partying.
But some of the times, especially with sex, you did want it, but you kept telling yourself you didn't, which was a really
Yes.
interesting dilemma.
So we should probably dwell for a moment on Rory's views about sex.
Yes, so the flip side is of not wanting to do things is the character's motivations are also from sort of purity and innocence. and the conflict of purity and innocence. So when confronted with sort of the need to grow up. So while a lot of the other characters are really trying to sleep with each other, or kind of motivations are, some motivations are based in sex, the unicorn itself is supposed to maintain kind of a level of purity. And that's reinforced by the fact that if the unicorn kisses a non-virgin or lays her head in the lap of a non-virgin, then you take harm. If you actually have sex with a character, you lose all of your integrity points. So one of the struggles of the unicorn is how you engage with other characters in a game about sexy monsters when you can't necessarily be a sexy monster. Or you can.
And people can roll to turn you on all the time, so you can
Yes.
be turned on, but you don't want to act on it.
Yes.
Exactly. So.
And it's deeply ironic that this character would fall for the polyamorous character.
Yes. So
We ended up with a pairing we ended up calling the Sulky Corn. So how did Rory and Gwen get together?
Well, I mean, it started out based on how one of the skins works. I think part of your skin was someone was in love with you. It gives you like a list of like, these are the strings that exist at the beginning of the game. And you got 2 strings on someone who was in love with you or something.
Yeah, something like
And
that.
it was just kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess it could be me. And we didn't even really have a sense of, I don't even know if I had any idea of who Gwen was at that point. I was kind of like, okay, we'll play with that. But
Yeah.
So at some point we decided that there must be a relationship there, but it certainly wasn't planned out really at all. The classroom map we also have has kind of a dotted line between me and the teacher, and my sort of original idea was that I'd probably have this hopeless crush on the teacher that was inappropriate.
I got there first.
And it was going to be kind of Rory's internal conflict, that she wanted a relationship, but the only person she wanted a relationship with was the teacher, Mr. Kensington, and that was wrong, and he was married, and all of these things that I thought would be good for kind of like an awkward teenage girl who didn't really want to be with the rest of her peers. But then this really awesome relationship with Gwen developed pretty organically, and it became this kind of the key pairing of the game.
It was a very sweet relationship, and I think it really started when Gwen, you were really vulnerable at the school dance because the witch had tried to beat you up.
right, the ocean realized that I was sad, and so I had to kill the witch and her boyfriend.
And the ocean left something that could be traced back to you.
Yes, so she finishes, she finds Gwen and kind of assaults her and says, like, you tried to kill me, and Gwen's kind of doesn't know what to do and is afraid she's going to get attacked, and I think, like, busts straight through the dance screaming, like, that kind of thing. Everyone looks at her and goes, oh, what's wrong with that girl? And finds herself, like, outside in the park, like, covered in dirt and ripped dress, and then Rory comes over and is like, it's okay, like, you can come stay with me, and I'll, it'll be okay, and it's this kind of, like, Gwen's a little drunk and a little,
And going, I can't go back to that house because
Can't
the
go back to
person
the
who
house,
I lived there with just tried to kill me.
And and then just kind of they went home together and started talking. I think they just laid together the first night, but it was this very intimate kind of...
Yeah, it was a really good scene.
It was the first adult moment in the game.
Yeah.
By I don't mean like adult content, I mean like this feels like 2 adults interacting with each other rather than 2 teenagers interacting.
Right.
Yeah.
And then sort of as the game went on, we found that a lot of the dark powers in the town, both Micah's demon and the teacher's husband, Elton, they were both after the unicorn in one way or another. They were after the power that the unicorn represented.
So being hunted was one of Rory's moves. And so the first person hunting her was one of her classmates, Zach. Zach was very into Rory. They went to the dance together. She blew him off.
Poor Zach was abandoned fairly quickly in favor of Gwen.
Then, yes, we moved to this, there's this shadowy creature, sort of humanoid creature that turned out to be sort of the ghost of your brother.
His power had been drained away by somebody really powerful, and it turned out to be
Elton
Elton
teacher,
Kensington, the teacher's
the witch,
husband.
yeah.
Yeah.
Then Micah was also hunting Rory.
Yes.
Yeah,
when I maxed out my strings, that was one of the things the demon gave me to do, was to be Rory's first time, because that would give us some sort of mystical connection that he could then use to possess a human body.
Yeah. And then, so there's this ongoing theme of, like, Rory is being hunted by one thing or another. at all times. And eventually we would learn that, she was the last unicorn. And Micah's big bad was like sort of the absence, like what was left over after her brother had been destroyed. The absence of her brother.
Yeah. And I had a lot of fun with Micah and Rory, because we had this whole thing where Rory, despite the fact she can be a little judgmental, she really does try to see the best in people if they come. And so I had a couple of times where I got to manipulate you into thinking I was going to be a better person. And it wasn't that I was entirely unsincere in that I didn't really want to do a blood sacrifice, but that didn't mean I wouldn't, which you eventually called me on when you figured out that I had repeatedly suckered you into feeling sorry for me.
Yes. It's in Rory's nature to... She sort of straddles that line between kind of being sanctimonious about her position in the world, but also really genuinely feeling for other people and wanting to help them. And so I did my best to try and see that Micah could be a good person.
And then I kept disappointing you.
And it stopped working.
So why don't you tell us about the character of the player who couldn't be here today?
So the player who couldn't be here was Vanessa, the witch. The witch had been at the school for a long time, was sort of a bookish jock. Their family had money, enough money that they could take exchange students from in France, in quotation marks.
I had very legal documents.
Yes.
In that all of them got lost in transit.
Yes.
Yeah.
The thing that characterizes the witch is that she gets picked on, she gets frustrated, she wants to be good, she wants to use her powers properly, but things keep happening around her that are just so frustrating, and she can't help but lash back.
And the lashing back is way disproportionate.
Yes, it always leaves her looking like the bad guy.
Yeah.
So, for example, we referenced these NPCs that she'd hexed. One of them, she caused him to have some kind of skin disease that caused his face to fall off. And the other one, she caused her to have her period so violently that they gave her a hysterectomy at the hospital.
Yeah. It was awful.
It was really awful.
Yeah.
I think, yes, so the witch is sort of characterized by this, that she ends up in these situations where she goes too far and is probably aware that she went too far. And to some degree that you can't take things back that you do is one of the themes of the skin. And learning to live with that, but also learning how to not do those things. So she was very interested in, there's this relationship with an NPC named David. That was the primary one that characterized her relationship. The other major relationship she had was with Minako, who was Gwen's girlfriend. They were best friends at the beginning of the game. And after the school dance, when she went into her darkest self and was trying to get at Gwen, she seduced Minako, tried to poison her against her lover, Gwen.
Yes, which worked for quite a while until
Yeah.
they actually got to sit down. Actually, I think until Vanessa told her she was going back to David.
Yeah, Vanessa dumped Minako fairly brutally, and then Minako was really upset, and finally she and Gwen talked and sort of patched things up. And this was after then Gwen was now with Rory, and Rory had said yes, it was fine if Gwen had multiple relationships, but really didn't mean it, which we'll talk about in a second.
I think we're getting there, but the other important thing is that one big bad, the teacher's husband, who was also a witch, was her father. So it was a thing with this game that we'll probably talk about GMing later, but because of something that the player did, at that point it made sense for her to do this. And then this theme of hypnotism and memories not being what they seem to be became a theme towards the end of the game with this character.
Yeah, and specifically that her father had sort of, over the years, hypnotized his ex-wife, his daughter, his present husband, was constantly hypnotizing them and controlling them to do what he wanted. Yes. And Vanessa was starting to go down that path herself.
Right.
And could she check herself in time before she sort of repeated the sins of the father, more or less? He did kill her rather brutally in the end. So she did turn against her father, and he killed her right before I could kill him.
Right. So, but ultimately did not repeat the cycle.
No. And she came back as a ghost because Rory tried to tie her to this plane to bring her back, and you couldn't save her life, but you tied her ghost to the physical plane.
There's a fire that's fueling in the workplace, as it describes, and old friends fall from grace. You can't just go, get up
we've just talked a lot about the fact that obviously sex is a main theme in this game. So can we talk about that in a little more detail?
I think we must.
So this is one of the only games I've ever played where this is a main theme.
Yeah. It's also interesting that we've done a couple of one-shots of this game that have been really good and interesting and satisfying. But something that I've noticed is that this theme of exploring your sexuality, there's not enough time in a one-shot to get to it.
It's true.
Not really. Some of the, like, it's still sort of there, but, like, this experience of playing it in a campaign, well, watching you guys play it in a campaign, it was a relaxed pace enough that there was time for you guys to find truth in play.
I don't know about you guys, but I can certainly say where I ended up sexually with my character was not where I thought I was going to go. It was very surprising. And we ended up with some interesting meditations on sort of teenage sexuality and then sexuality in general.
Yeah, so like there's a whole page dedicated to this game to like embracing queer content and not being afraid and specifically shooting for it. Yeah. And we did find some like unusual truths with these characters that I think are really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you started out with 4 female players, so obviously there were going to be a lot of same-sex relationships because we were all playing female characters as well.
Yes.
But even beyond that, I think we pushed the boundaries. And yeah, that's the really interesting thing Monsterhearts does with sexuality. I think we may have talked about this before. One of the main roles is to turn someone on. And what happens is if I say I roll to turn Melissa on and I succeed, she can decide what that means and how she reacts to that and whether or not she likes that she's turned on by me, but she cannot deny the fact that she's turned on by me.
Yeah, there's a core idea in this game that because you're a teenager and your sort of sexual self-identity hasn't yet become a concrete thing, that you don't, if your self-image is that you're straight or gay or whatever, something may turn you on and surprise you. And that then becomes part of who you are. And to some degree, all of the characters in this game did explore these themes. All of the characters either had sex or at least went on a date with somebody of both genders. Most of the characters slept with somebody of both genders.
Yep.
And then, like, everybody found different truths. Vanessa, the witch, ended up sort of having sort of more traditional pairing with her boyfriend, but she did seduce her friend Minako and then ultimately rejected that relationship. Yeah. And Micah, where did you end up?
I ended up sort of weirdly. One thing I discovered near the very end of the game, and I love it when I discover things in play, was that despite how horrible Micah could really be as a character, which she certainly could be, she actually was fairly protective of the people she'd slept with. In every case, including Rory, actually, at the end. She sort of maneuvered things so that she did not have to do anything to Rory to appease her demon at the end. Right. But more than that, so she ended up with 2 relationships that sort of lasted through the game. Beyond that, and they're both strange ones. So the first girl she seduced, Nadia, so she's a bit of a darker character. And initially with that relationship, the relationship really played with power dynamics. And so initially Micah was the one who was in charge of that relationship and really pushing it. And then specifically when I was in my darkest self and then my most vulnerable, Nadia started taking all the power in that relationship, and it became very much a dom-sub relationship. Yeah. And what became increasingly aware was that Micah was cool with that. I mean, initially it looked like Nadia was pushing Micah to be sexual in a way she didn't want to, and that's certainly sort of the way Micah tried to play it to Rory, but it became increasingly clear that was what she was doing to manipulate Rory, and actually Micah kind of liked being a sub. Yeah,
it was interesting to have a character who is so much seeking power in her own life, but in her relationship is so much characterized by not having power.
Yeah, yeah.
And we have a number of sweet moments with these characters where, like, Nadia at one point gave Micah a choker that had a locking mechanism on it, and then she wore the key.
And sort of there were a couple times where Nadia pushed further than Micah was willing to go, and Micah pushed back, and they sort of found an equilibrium of power in there. But Nadia really had the power sexually in that relationship by the end of it.
It's worth mentioning that this happened over the course of, like, 6 sessions, probably.
Yeah.
Initially, it looks like Micah's not entirely cool with what's happening, and then it becomes clear that she is okay with it. And then they find and establish a boundary, and they both acknowledge it.
Yeah.
But
I am not claiming this was the healthiest relationship in the world. These were still 2 teenagers negotiating a dom-sub relationship, and maybe not always doing it well, but in the end, it became the point that they both were kind of cool with where they were. So that was one of them, and then the other one was the part where Micah seduced the teacher, and at the very end of the game, sort of after they'd killed his husband, Micah and him together, actually, they sat down and had this really, like, weird little epilogue where Micah was like, I am totally bad for you. Like, this is a bad idea to keep sleeping with your student. And he's like, yeah, but I haven't made a decision on my own for a long time, so I'm going to make this call.
Yeah.
And so they ended up staying together, this teacher-student relationship, which, in real life should really probably not have happened, but in the game sort of weirdly kind of worked.
Well, in the game, because it's a constrictive narrative, we know that this relationship is not abusive. Or if it is abusive, it's because the student is abusing the teacher.
Yes.
Because she has demon power behind her.
Yes.
That's the power dynamics.
And now is not just making deals with the devil, but is in fact.
Yeah, is the devil, and it's about to graduate. So as far as Joe went, Micah was the one who pushed for that relationship all the way along, and that was partly me playing with Micah really liked to be transgressive, and that sort of became apparent that as a big dark evil power, she was probably not going to try to make people do things they didn't want to. She was going to have a lot of fun letting people free to do things they wanted to that they probably shouldn't.
Yeah. And then the third relationship that really characterized you was your relationship with Rory.
Yes. And that was very manipulative.
That was very manipulative.
Yeah.
But not, from Rory's standpoint, it seemed not entirely unwanted. It was sort of this almost pressure release valve that you had.
I think that it was confusing for Rory, I think, is really what it was. Rory, when I started the character, I kind of envisioned her really struggling and maybe never growing that much, struggling with her sexuality and never really growing that much because of the kind of purity and innocence ideal that you're starting from. So I pictured Rory as someone who really wanted affection and maybe attention and maybe a companion, but nothing too serious, or at least nothing too sexual, and trying to kind of place that against the other sort of the tension of being a sexy monster, like I said before.
Well, certainly surrounded by everybody else who's super hormonal and trying to get laid constantly, and you have a guy at the school who won't leave you alone, is leaving flowers on your desk.
And I kept trying to turn you on, and most of the time I succeeded.
Yes.
Which didn't mean you had to then reciprocate, but we'd sort of established that.
But eventually I decided that part of Rory's journey would be learning to grow up through the game. And part of learning to grow up is learning how to embrace adult relationships, adult in sort of both or many senses of the word, adult in maturity and adult in sexuality.
Although to be fair, at the time that I actually did manage to seduce you, part of why that happened was because you were really pissed at your girlfriend at the time, because you had told her you were okay with a poly relationship, but you really weren't.
And I think that's an interesting point to bring up too, is that one of my forays into becoming, a sort of sexually mature adult was actually out of revenge.
Yeah, because for the while you did something that I think was perfect for Rory, because it's the sort of thing where I think I am doing the mature thing by telling Gwen I am fine with this, when really the mature thing would have been to say, yeah, no, I'm not really fine with this.
And so that was part of her journey too. That's part of her learning how to grow up, is she was uncomfortable with the idea of an open relationship or a poly relationship, and so she lied to make Gwen feel better, which is also kind of against Rory's nature, which I think is a key point as well, that kind of starting to make these mistakes and starting to run counter to the original intention of the character is symbolic of their growing up, because there's a recognition that the world is not black and white.
Yeah. And also that your own needs are perfectly valid, that you don't have to suppress what you need all the time as well. In a relationship,
Exactly.
you need to be able to say to your partner, I need this as well.
Exactly. So my sort of ending point for my character was, becoming an adult, moving towards a place where I really enjoyed sex and had a lot of it with my girlfriend.
Yeah. And one little foray into revenge sex with me.
Yes.
Yes.
After a sort of negative encounter.
Which you disclosed right away, immediately felt bad, and Gwen was just very understanding of oh, I'm sorry it was a bad experience for you, I'm glad you told me, and that was a very nice mature little moment too.
Yeah.
Gwen was awesome. She was very good to me.
Yeah. We also had those lovely interactions where Gwen's girlfriend Minako, that you were sort of on and off with, you were super aggressive towards her as part of that growing process.
Yes.
Well, do we want to, why don't we talk about Gwen and Minako, and then we'll talk about how the three of you interacted.
Yeah. So Gwen and Minako were together when the story started. I think the idea was that, so as Gwen was living with the witch, Vanessa, had her best friend over for a sleepover in the night. Maybe they just kind of had met, and, Minako snuck back into the room late into the, or early in the morning. Vanessa wasn't entirely fine with it, but hadn't entirely faced that either.
Yeah, she definitely didn't like that her best friend had just slept with her new sister.
Yeah. House sister? There's probably a term for this that we don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah.
The foreign exchange student who was living with her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Had, seduced her best friend, or perhaps the other way around. We don't really know. But knowing Gwen, probably she initiated. And knowing who Minako is.
Yeah. And Minako was a really good pairing for Gwen initially because Minako was sort of very cool with the idea that Gwen wanted to sleep with multiple people. Minako just wanted to be included. She was fine with that.
She was more like I think we have written on her sheet, she's like a keener, like she's front row center, like very a good student, well behaved, and it was kind of like this was her opportunity to kind of like explore things that she wouldn't normally have done.
Yeah.
And Gwen, of course, is very open and would just kind of state whether she liked things or not, and it was kind of, in a way for her, I guess it must have been kind of safer because she had this like probably pretty good feedback about what they were doing. And they broke up for a while after Vanessa convinced Minako that she tried to kill her. And then when that relationship fell apart, they kind of got back together and kind of, I think she bought her a pop. I think Gwen showed up and bought Minako like her favorite soda and was like, hey, we should talk.
And and ultimately those two did end up together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we had this sort of interesting relationship where we had one polyamorous character, Gwen, in a committed relationship with someone who was monogamous. And in theory, they had both said, like, this is fine. Like, you were fine with her being polyamorous. Right. She was fine with you being monogamous.
Right.
And it was interesting that, so in the time that Gwen had broken up with Minako, Gwen got together with Rory. Mm-hmm. And so that relationship had just settled by the time Vanessa broke up with Minako, and then Gwen and Minako got back together.
If this sounds like a soap opera, it was.
Absolutely.
Very much so.
But there are these great scenes where, like, Gwen and Vanessa are trying to work out their problems, and they, like, Vanessa's mom is mediating, and they're saying, okay, well, did you hurt her? What's going on? And then, Vanessa brings Minako for support, and Gwen brings Rory for support, and they're sitting in the other room. And it's kind of like, oh, well, I didn't know you were sleeping with her. And it's like, oh, well, she never ever mentions you, so I don't really care.
Yes, as Rory, I turned into a terrible, terrible person. I was really awful to Minako.
If you mess with the unicorn, you get the horn.
Yes.
Poor Minako. She was fairly willing to share Gwen, and then every time she tried to, like, say anything to you, you're like, yeah, well, Gwen's never mentioned you.
Well, she did have that one really kind of mean scene at the end, though, where there was a party, and just Rory and Minako had a little fight, and Rory stormed away, and then Minako's just like, oh, I'll share. And everyone kind of looked at them, and Rory was just like, screw you.
Yeah.
And
that was Minako at the end of her rope, because,
Yes, I had been terrible to Minako. That was my... There was nothing wrong with Minako, and she was not a bad character, and she was actually kind of trying to extend the olive branch to me and sort of be, sort of say, we can work this out, we can all be together, it's not a big deal, we can all be friends, and Rory, who was really upset and really just wanted to be with Gwen, was going to have none of that, and so was incredibly dismissive and cold and awful.
Yeah, and I think that was one of Rory's realizations later, was that she wasn't always as mature as she'd wanted to think she was.
Exactly, so my jealousy and lashing out at Minako was also a growing moment.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's like hard for her to admit that because she's the one who's like, she's into social justice, she's forward thinking, right? That it was hard for her to admit that she actually wasn't as cool with this stuff as she wanted to be, right? Because like being cool with this relationship was also being cool in a way.
Yes.
And she just wasn't able to do that.
Right.
So we've just sort of talked a lot about the sexual relationships we had and how they were all kind of interesting and unexpected. So what was it like playing a role-playing game that delved so much into sex as well as other games we've played?
I'll say that it was interesting running a game about teenage sexuality being the only male at this table.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a problem by any stretch. There was this moment at the end of episode 1 when Gwen was trying to hook up with Brandon and Minako on the beach and was interrupted by the witch. And the witch and David, who had come to the beach to make out, they got into a fight, and Vanessa left, I think.
They got into a messy fight on the beach in the water, and it was full of sexual tension.
But I think in the aftermath, there was this question of like, well, does anybody still want to hook up? Right? And my understanding of male teenage sexuality is like, it's actually pretty shy. Like it's this fragile construct of like, you know, trying to put on this appearance of being like, oh yeah, I'm cool with sex, like, and like not afraid of sex at all, when in fact you are terrified, and like, just trying not to let it show. And
say the reaction of the women at the table are like, really? None of the guys here are willing to just have sex when someone's there going, anybody want to have sex?
Yeah, I mean, Gwen was like completely willing to have sex with like pretty much anybody to try it out. And, like, it took her, like, I think she was the last person in the group to have sex.
Yeah.
It was, like, episode 3, she finally got something, well, during the game, because she'd been in Malco, but...
So none of us being teenage boys were like, really? Is it that hard? Come on.
Yeah, well, and, like, if nothing had disrupted the situation, it probably would have gone ahead. But because there was this disruptive element, I think, like, it just sort of shattered the illusion for these guys. And it just... that was the thing that seemed right to me. Likewise, like, I don't have a great sense of what it is to be a teenage girl.
Fair.
Yeah. So, which you guys all do. You all played female, so you could hook it directly into your characters.
Mike is very different from my experience as a teenager. Thank God.
Well, and I mean, like, it's sort of inherent to this genre that, like, no teenagers have as much sex as anybody in this genre, right?
Yeah, that's true.
But, like, the idea is that you are sort of expressing something that I think every teenager wants to this degree.
Yeah.
Right? Or doesn't want in the case of teenagers like Rory. Or maybe wants, but won't allow herself to have.
Didn't take that much work.
Yeah.
No,
but
that's true.
Like, it wasn't
much
really
easier than I seemed.
like, this wasn't like an ongoing problem. It was just like sort of interesting to be in the position of running a game for as the only male at the table.
And we did have one moment where one of the relationships ended up making someone at the table uncomfortable, and we had to sort of sit and go back to our social contract and say, okay, well, how can we sort of not push that button for that person anymore, which is part and parcel of needing the social contract to be something that is open to revision anytime anyone has. And in a game like this, where you're dealing with sexuality far more openly than any other game I've ever played, you gotta expect probably something's gonna come up at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, that probably is a good connection for me. Like, probably one of, like, the fundamental things that made this game, like, possible and probably even enjoyable, is that, like, I felt like I could really trust you guys with what was happening. Like, I don't know if I would have been as calm and cool in a lot of the scenes if I didn't feel like, you know, you guys would all have my back, or that, you know, like, if I'm having a scene with Rory and we're having this fight about whether or not, you know, it's okay in our relationship, if I'd felt like there was some animosity between us, it would have been much harder to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. You know, Gwen and Rory had some great scenes, so Melissa and I together had some great scenes. Mm-hmm. And I also had some really good scenes with Megan when I was Rory and she was various characters, a couple of NPCs, and as Micah. And, you know, one of those scenes was revenge sex, and one of those scenes was yelling at each other about, we got into a big argument about something, and I can't remember exactly what it was.
It was when I was trying to free the teacher, when you tied him to the bed.
There was a perfectly reasonable explanation
and I can't remember exactly why you stabbed me, but it was something to do with the fact that essentially I had tricked you into sex.
The stabbing thing was interesting. I didn't think it was that one, though, because there's... is like, I'm not trying to hurt you, but of course, like, Rory took that as, like, a threat.
Right, yes, yeah. You try to help the teacher, and I was like, I'm taking him, it doesn't matter. And I'm like, I'm not trying to hurt you here. That's right. And you then stabbed me in the shoulder.
You know, those scenes actually involve Megan and I yelling at each other and saying awful things to each other. And I think in any sort of instance of emotional vulnerability for the player, whether it's anger or, I don't know, joy or a sex scene, if you're not comfortable with the other players, then it's really difficult to play it all out.
Yeah. And especially when we're playing, I mean, I was playing somebody very different from myself. And there are times after I was doing one of those scenes where I was trying to manipulate you into sex, and I'd be doing things like using the rope burns on my arm to, like, you know, make you feel bad for me, when actually I had quite enjoyed getting those rope burns in the first place. Micah, and I, like, afterwards I'd come over and like, I'm so sorry. Like, after the scene was over, because I had tons of fun doing the scene, and I'm like, I'm really sorry I was manipulating you like that. But we both knew that was, you know, okay, which made them all possible. So yeah, without trust, this game is just not possible.
I don't think we could have played this game if we had not played your game first, Megan.
Yeah, this is probably not a campaign game that anybody should play as the first game with a new group. I would definitely say
Definitely
that.
not.
Yeah, it's important not just because of the content, but also just because you need to be able to have frank discussions about like what you're comfortable with and what you're not. Which with a new group, you don't.
Yeah.
Sometimes people don't want to be the uncool person at the table.
Yeah.
And say like, oh, I'm not cool with that. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important part is that all of the players need to be able to say, okay, I have a boundary here, and all of the other players have to respect that and not question it.
Yeah.
You have to be comfortable playing with sexuality and having sex on screen or off screen, depending on how your group wants to do it. I mean, sex is a part of it, drama is a part of it.
Yeah, and in our games, I mean, we mostly did we'd get up right up to the moment of sex and draw a veil. That was generally the way we handled it.
And it's a key component of Monsterhearts, but you still have to be with a group that respects certain lines, and so it's really important to have that kind of social contract that is always on the table and can be renegotiated.
When you're on a mountain with faces in the sea, they're on to something, wallowing beneath a tiny log.
I gotta say, like, I don't think I've ever seen or played a game that explores these themes in such a way that is so evocative. Simply because you sort of don't have a lot of say over which direction you go in, right? Things sort of, to a degree, happen to you, and then, because we're good role players, we go with it and build on what is already on the table. But, because you don't have a say in what turns you on, in another game, it could have been the case that, like, the Selkie and the Unicorn may not have ended up together, because on the surface of it, it's a pairing that doesn't make a lot of sense. In the end, it totally worked, but it worked because we were sort of pushed in that direction by the game. This is one of these situations where, like, I feel like the game really does a great job of pushing us in interesting directions, in a way that I've rarely seen in any other game. Yeah.
It's probably one of the reasons I love this game so much is that we could totally play this game again and have one of us switch out our characters or our skins, and it would be entirely different.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really would be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because they all play off each other in such interesting ways.
I've played in 3 different one-shots of this game. And it's different playing in one-shots because you're playing in movie mode instead of TV mode. But all of those games have been totally different from each other.
Yep.
Where, like, I mean, you and I have played 2 games where we've, like, ended up in a relationship together.
To some degree, definitely.
Yeah, and both of them have a power dynamic, but each one is totally different, right? And interesting both times. Heather, I think you've only played in one Monsterhearts one-shot.
Just the one shot.
Right, but playing the Fae, the Fae was totally different from this character. Your Fae was very assertive, very direct. She knew what she wanted. She was very self-assured in a way that Rory was absolutely not.
Yeah.
Or at least Rory pretended to be, but maybe wasn't actually. Megan, you played in a one-shot. You played Immortal.
Yeah, I ended up not liking that skin as much as I thought.
Yeah,
that was one I'd always wanted to play, and then I played it, and I was like, the Infernal's more fun.
Well, I mean, I wonder if you would feel different in campaign play, but...
Perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, but sort of your Mortal was totally different from your Infernal.
Yes.
And in a way that was really interesting. And, like, I've done now the Ghoul skin and the Neighbor. Again, which, like, one of those characters was, like, taking advantage of people and, like, hunting sex, more or less. And the other character was sort of always surprised by how much she was getting laid.
Yeah.
And how interested people were in her and had these terrible issues of self-esteem. It's really interesting how, like, every time we've played these games, these relationships are totally different. And this game has a tremendous amount of replayability.
Yeah, and it does. And I will say now, it has a tremendous potential for campaign play. I'm said I was surprised by that. I totally said that. So, I mean, I have only ever run the one-shots, which, I mean, for the one-shots, you can't really prepare as a GM because you don't even know what skins people are going to play. there's very little you can do besides come up with a list of questions to generate NPCs with. But Colin, you're the other one who's done this in long-term play, so how does that change GMing for you?
Well, so this is a game that is, it's still really difficult to prepare for. Even more so than running something like PTA, where you already don't have a lot of say over the way things go because there's so much shared narrative control. I could come to the table with sort of a few ideas for moments I might like to get in place, but so much of the game is player versus player, where like the relationship between Rory and Micah might advance in a certain point during the episode. And so I might come to the table with notes that are like, I'd like to do something with Micah's girlfriend, Nadia, right? And it might look like this, but that's all the prep I can really do. So GMing this is opportunistic, I think is the word. Like I sort of have to like look for my chance and then jump on it. And sometimes that meant like adding a tale to a scene or calling for a scene. But yeah, it was interesting and challenging to play because I was always walking away from the table surprised and delighted by how sessions go. Many games I come away from the table feeling like it was a well-executed plan or perhaps a poorly executed plan, right? Mm-hmm. But like this was as much fun to run, I think. Or maybe, I don't know if it was as much fun to play as it was to run, but I had fun running it in a way that I don't always have running other games because I was always like surprised and delighted by things that happened during play.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. I did have this experience running the game that this game is layers like an ogre. As you're playing, as we were playing the game, I'd page through the book to look up something and stop and just read a page that I hadn't read in a while. Or I'd be looking at one of your skins just to think about like checking wordings of things, but also to check on just to make sure I'm synced up with where the character is. And every other session, I would have a moment which is like where another layer would come off of the ogre, and I would say like, oh, that's why this is set up the way it is. I'd have like new insights into the way the game was played. So I think it was around episode 3, I was rereading the unicorn skin. We'd had some discussion at the table about the way the unicorn sex move is set up, that like it's like damaging to her to kiss people who are non-virgins. She can lay her heads in the laps of non-virgins, but she can't kiss them, and if she has sex, she loses her integrity. There was some discussion at one point about changing that to be something that maybe better suited the character. I had this insight that like, well, that doesn't represent, maybe it doesn't represent you dying. Maybe harm represents the sapping of your unicorn essence, and maybe you're becoming a normal human.
Right.
And so I took that to you, Heather, and we had a discussion over lunch and decided, yeah, like maybe there's an outcome for this where like if I take 4 harm as a unicorn, maybe I just become immortal.
Right. I remember being kind of frustrated. I just sort of felt like I was never going to get in on the drama if I didn't. And maybe this is my own understanding of the game. I kind of felt like I couldn't get in on the drama because the unicorn wanted to be a little bit removed from it all the time. Mm-hmm. And that is the struggle of the unicorn, and I was just having a hard time sort of navigating how to be removed and involved, which is, a struggle that if you are introverted or something, people have that struggle. How do you sort of be yourself and be part of a group? Yeah.
I remember you saying like, well, I don't want to like hook up with my girlfriend and die from it.
Yes, and so for a while,
which is a valid thing.
Yeah,
I kind of
that would be
agree.
That would be a very distressing morning to wake up to.
Yes.
So I was taking, but I actually, and that's a good point. I was taking the idea of harm very literally.
We all were.
Yeah. If I kiss a non-virgin, so every time I try to kiss my girlfriend, I'm going to have this. I'm going to get weaker and weaker, and maybe it will kill me, and then how will I be part of the game? And it was kind of snowballing, and then we had this discussion, like, it doesn't need to necessarily mean you will be removed from the game, or you will have to change your skin or something. It can mean something else, and that can be part of character development.
And so I think initially we were describing when you started sleeping with Gwen, that like you seemed weaker or frailer, but we sort of moved halfway through the game to describing it as there's a glow about Rory, and then like depending on what your harm level was, you were like sort of not quite so lustrous, right? That like her hair wasn't quite so shiny, in like supernaturally shiny as it would be
Right.
otherwise. So you could see that she's sort of becoming normal.
Right.
Likewise, there was another moment a few weeks later where everybody had a lot of strings, and we weren't really doing anything with them. And I had a bunch of strings on you guys, and so I was trying to figure out, like, we're not doing this right. So I went hunting through the book again and was looking for advice. We were also frustrated we felt like, because the moves don't trigger with intentionality, you don't say, I'm trying to turn somebody on. If you describe a scene where you are turning somebody on, that's when you roll. So we were becoming a little bit frustrated because we'd end up in, like, romantically charged scenes, and then we'd have to roll to turn somebody on, even though it's well established that this person's interested in you. And so around that time I realized, like, so you can offer somebody a point of experience and cross off a string in order to get them to do what you want. And so we started using that to, I think, deliberately to sidestep having to roll to turn somebody on.
When it was already apparent somebody was turned on, you said, here's an experience point for it, rather than having to go through are you or not.
Yeah, so Mike at one point went to Rory and said, like, you guys are sitting outside in the garden, Rory's just had a fight with a girlfriend, and Mike is like, kiss me.
Yeah, I just gave you a string for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then she kissed you, and then you gave her another string and it's like, do you want to go off in the garden together? And so, like, it's around that moment when, like, I feel like we sort of really figured out how to use the game system in an effective way. So it means that anytime there's, like, precedent for what's happening in the game, it allows you to sidestep the game, which is actually, I think, something that's really important in a lot of good role-playing games. They set up the drama, but then they get out of the way once the drama's actually happening in most of the best games. I mean, people always say that, like, it was a really good session, we never picked up the dice, right? That's a classic thing to say. And this game actually has a mechanic built so that it just gets out of the way when there's precedent for things happening.
When both people already agree on what's going to happen next, there's no need to go through.
Yeah.
Is it going to happen or not?
Well, and not only that, but, like, Rory gets a reward.
Yes.
For, like, following through on the plot line that you guys have already set up.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
I mean, I also, when you do roll the dice, and I mean, I'm coming at this from not really playing other games that are maybe dice heavy or mechanic heavy, but I found that the options that you're given from your roll are just kind of an outline for where you can take it next. So they tend to complement a storyline and its development. So you're kind of given a sketch of something, and then with the roll, and then the way that you fill that out is the color and the texture of the drama and the story that's already there. I find that, you know, even if you have to roll for something, it doesn't tend to be intrusive into the narrative.
Yeah. It's well designed.
Like to a weird degree, actually, I think that's true. I can't remember the last time I played a game that involved so much rolling and mechanics that did not feel obtrusive to my play experience or my watching experience. But then when I've done one-shots too, I feel this way. But it's interesting that, like, there's just these layers kept coming off the game and kept having new realizations, which eventually culminated in when the second last episode begins. Growing up moves unlock.
Yes.
So there's a special set of advances that characters can take at the end of the game that represent moves that allow you to bypass teenage bullshit, which are call people on their bullshit.
Makes someone feel beautiful.
Right.
Intervene in active violence and share your pain?
Share your pain, yes. Those moves unlock, as well as the option to change your sex move or your darkest self to reword it in some way, or you can change your skin. I think there's another option.
I can't remember, but we all had that option at the end. We can do something major with our sort of Roller's Dungeons. You can do something major to your character at the end,
which showcases how your character has changed or grown over the course of the game.
Or in my case, lack of growth.
Well, no, but I think that your character did grow too. There's just what happened with your character is there just isn't a skin that really works.
Yeah, there wasn't a skin I wanted to change her to. Growing up move seemed wrong, and I didn't want to back away from how dark she had been as a character. I really wanted to pull that through at the end and be the bad guy.
Yeah, like, in a way, I think your character may have become a queen, except that the queen moves don't quite work for your character, but in tone, the queen skin is correct.
Yes.
So that's what happened with Micah, is that she did change in a significant way, we just didn't represent it mechanically.
Yeah, I just went to you and I said, this is what I want to try at the end. I will not be upset if it doesn't work, but I want to become the big bad. If there was ever a next season, let's make Micah into the NPC who would be the big bad.
Yeah, and so we did that, and it was really interesting.
Yeah.
And then what about Gwen?
Well, so of the options, I did debate for a little while of making Gwen into like the mortal, of just kind of her accepting being human and kind of completely denouncing what she was before. But that didn't feel entirely right. And then as far as like the sex move and the darkest self went, the darkest self is really great about like being like the ocean, and things have been taken, you'll take them back, and it's very harsh, kind of like that thunderstorm idea of ocean. I really like that too. And kind of where I wanted to go with Gwen was that she was growing up in a more traditional way, and for her that was something different, something that she wouldn't normally have gotten to do. And I didn't actually pick all of the moves originally. I just knew I was going to take 2 of the growing up moves, and I waited for the situations to unfold that would cue them. So I think the first time was Rory had come to Gwen and she said, look, I had sex with Micah, and I feel really bad about it, and I'm really insecure, and I'm a terrible person, and was just beating herself up completely and saying how worthless she was. And like immediately Gwen took the move to make her feel beautiful, as this very mature scene of like, I made a mistake, and Gwen being like, it's okay, I love you anyways, and that was really great. And then the other one that I took, completely surprised me, because when I started Gwen, I never would have thought she would have chosen it, but she ended up intervening in acts of violence. And I think that actually might have a lot to do with the fact that she was involved with Rory, and Rory was being hunted. So these points throughout the story where Gwen was basically saying, don't be afraid, whatever happens, I'll protect you, I'll take care of you. And if she didn't have that relationship, she never would have gone in that direction. But there's the darkness came in at us, there was the teacher, there was just these things just kept happening, and Gwen just became the kind of person who would just step up, and at the end was holding the demon off of Micah so she could destroy it. I mean, not realizing, of course, what that implies, but the one who walks in the room sees something going wrong and immediately jumps at it and tries to help her friends.
Yeah, sees that the witch is already dead, sees that Micah's, in a struggle for her life, and jumps right in.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's interesting because I have, like, listening to Melissa kind of explain the thought process of how Gwen became an adult. I think I had a similar thought process with Rory, but we didn't talk about this outside of the game. We just let it play out as our characters. But it's funny to hear that because I had a similar sort of struggle. What is Rory going to do? Is she going to be a unicorn? Is she going to turn back into a full unicorn? Is she going to become a human? How is that going to play out? And it ended up being largely her relationship with Gwen is kind of what kept her in the world, though I did kind of remove myself. I sort of became a hermit at the end, but a hermit in not as a skin or anything like that. It's just that's where I took my character at the end, but I had toyed with the idea of becoming human, of becoming immortal.
It looked like for a long time that you were, because you were taking harm from...
Right.
And that's the way we sort of been playing it for a while, is that you would. And we never really said it would happen or not, but we toyed with it for a long time.
And then my relationship with Gwen went so well that I decided that I would try and stick with that if that was what Gwen wanted. And so I changed my sex move so that I could sort of have an adult relationship with Gwen, and we could have sex and have sort of a full, mature relationship.
Without that hurting your self-image.
Without that hurting who I was or how I felt about myself, and without it really changing Gwen in any way either.
I think you and I kicked around a few different wordings of it, that we might create an exception for somebody that was deemed your lover. But
right.
We ended up giving you the neighbor's sex move.
Right. Which I don't think I really used anyway, but...
I think the advances at the end of the season, many of them are largely symbolic of a change rather than something that you're actually going to delve into.
My favorite things was that, like, Gwen and I came to a decision about our relationship separately that really worked well.
Yeah.
So I said I like being with you, and I would like to be with you. I would like to continue to be with you. I don't really want to live in the world. I'm kind of tired of being around other people, but I would like to have a relationship with you, and whatever you decide is up to you. And sort of Gwen had kind of, was going to make her own decisions anyway, and I don't want to speak for Gwen, but I thought that was one of my favorite scenes, that the conclusion of that was nice.
Yeah, because she basically decided that, leaving, and going back to the ocean wasn't for her. That wasn't the right decision. But at the same time, she couldn't make her decision just entirely based on, this one relationship. She had to be the person she wanted to be. And, I think in the codex after, it ended up she goes to university and, is still hanging out with Malco and still, being Gwen. And she goes to her room and has a little Skype date with Rory, who's by herself, but they still have this relationship that they're maintaining, even though it's completely different than...
Yeah, it works for them. It fits who they are. They get to be the people they want to be, and they've become adults about how they deal with their relationship, and other people are not a factor.
Yep, and in the coda, I also got to stalk the halls of the university, not as a student, but as someone offering very bad deals to university students who needed to lighten up a little bit.
The player who isn't with us tonight, speaking of symbolic changes, the player who is not with us tonight, she got stabbed by her father and died, and became a ghost. The ghost skin is about not being able to get past trauma. Indeed, it seemed like she wasn't able to get rid of it. Get over it because she seized on Micah as being the source of her problem.
Yeah, there's that one move in the ghost skin that's delusional. So you become convinced someone caused your death, whether or not it is true, because Micah really didn't cause her death, but
I think
Vanessa more and more came to fixate on Micah as the cause of her death.
Yes, I think if we had more of an opportunity to play it out, it would have been that you didn't stop him soon enough.
Right.
But symbolically, she was never able to get past her trauma. And eventually, we actually went out in the game with her confronting you about the way you have changed. She accused you of becoming just like your father.
And I said, well, he never gave anybody a choice. He just hypnotized them into doing what they wanted. Everybody who takes my deals does it because they want to.
Yes. Which, there's actually this running theme in this game between protecting people at the cost of their free will versus, having free will and making bad decisions.
Yeah.
And in an interesting way, Vanessa and Micah ended up on opposite spectrums of that, where Vanessa routinely tried to help people by stripping them of their will to be able to do things that were harmful to themselves. And Micah would say, you can make whatever decision you want. I'm happy to help you. I'm happy to lead you down the garden path towards your doom.
Yeah. And to Vanessa specifically, she said, you don't have a body anymore. Would you like one back?
Yes.
And left it as, do you want to make a deal?
Yes.
And that's how we ended the whole thing.
Before we move on, there's something I thought was interesting about GMing this that I didn't quite get to. Something that was interesting about advances in this game, when you get an advance, you can unlock moves. And moves in this game are very much thematic. So because Rory has hunted, it very much sets up this theme that she is being hunted the whole game. Because Gwen has a move that summons the ocean, there's this aspect of things happening around her that aren't her fault. Because Micah has moves about making bad deals, that becomes a major theme for that character. Something that was interesting about running this game is that as you guys unlocked new moves and had new advances, that feeds back to me about the types of stories that you want to sort of move to telling about your character. So, for example, Vanessa the Witch picked hypnotism around episode 5, I think, maybe 6.
It's from the vampire skin,
which is from the vampire skin. And we said that she did it in a witchy way.
Yeah.
But she picked hypnotism. And from then on, that said to me that I needed to make this into a theme, this aspect of making decisions and stripping people of decisions. So she'd also been around that time saying she wanted to do a plotline with her mother and her parents. And so because she picked that move, her father became somebody who hypnotized people.
It wasn't until then that you, I think, decided that the teacher's husband was also her father.
Yeah, so because she picked hypnotism, it became possible for me to say that this was always the case and you never knew.
Right.
Because he had made her forget. That was sort of true for all of you, that moves that you would pick would sort of later feed into things that I was going to do with your characters, or themes through yourself. Rory, halfway through the game, picked the true love move from the mortal skin, right? Targeting Gwen with it.
Right. Yes.
That saying that Gwen was her true love, which provided this interesting contrast point. But it was interesting running this that, like, it created clear signals to me about the kinds of things you guys wanted to see with your characters next, and likely ways to build themes. Now, I mean, it wasn't perfect because sometimes there were just too many things happening. For example, Gwen picked up the siren song move partway through the game, which, if she gets soaking wet, she can sing and, like, sort of hypnotize people.
It's an entrancement. They walk towards you in trance.
Yeah. Like, try as I might, there was just no good opportunity to get you soaking wet, which you wouldn't think.
Surprisingly, yeah.
There's one point in the middle of a combat, you're like, just a second, I need to go get a shower.
It was when Mr. Kensington, we were trying to type Mr. Kensington, and he was brainwashed. He was trying to leave and get Rory killed. So I'm like, hang on. And I, like, ran to the shower and come out soaking wet, and Rory's, like, knocked him unconscious with a frying pan.
Standing over
Yeah.
him.
And Gwen's like, I'm wet for no reason now. Oh, no. Why does this keep happening?
And again, I felt like I shortcutted your move there, and I'm sorry for that. But what I was trying to do in that scene was trying to get Rory to transgress her own rules.
Yes, and there was two things happening, but basically one of them had to happen, and the move was probably the least important, realistically. And that also forced Gwen to be much more forward about how she acted in combats, which then changed how she grew up. And
The two combats that we ever had in this game.
Well, I think in all the combats we were in the game, I'm pretty sure Gwen actually, like, picked up something and started beating people down. So
Yeah.
and a little surprisingly. I was gonna say one of my favorite parts of, like, the game probably is that when you play the skins, you get, like, a sheet, and it's like one piece of paper, like, really easy to play, right? And you can play entirely off that piece of paper, and the game is, like, great. But then you can choose moves from other skins, or you can upgrade your abilities in interesting ways, like taking True Love, or like Gwen took one called Ashamed, which let her give people strings to get a +3 to turning them on. And those, I mean, that wouldn't have fit for every Selkie, probably not even most of them, but specifically for her, this Fey move really fit.
I like how those being able to choose moves from outside your skin sort of suggests that your character is growing beyond the, like, strict archetype that you started as. Mm-hmm. Like, this is true of both of you. Micah, I don't think ever picked a move from another skin.
No.
But for both of you, the moment that you picked a move from another skin said something significant about who your character was and the way you might be different from other people in your skin. When Gwen's brother showed up, he's not unashamed in the way that she is, right? Mm-hmm. So he's very much like Gwen in a lot of ways, but there's that aspect of him that he's not, like, sort of quite as directly sexual as she is. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I like the game allows you to do that without overcomplicating it or making it difficult or anything like that. Like, it's really simple. Just flip through and pick another move that fits.
Yeah. There's a thing in this game that I noticed while running it, and then being challenged running it with a different group at one point, that ambiguity is an interesting part of the game. You can pick moves from other skins, but there's no guidelines about how that works, right? You could say for some characters, picking a move from a Fey skin might represent actually, like, getting a bit of Fey magic into you, right? Mm-hmm. But in your case, it actually just represents something about your character as a Selkie. Or not even as a Selkie, just as an individual.
Maybe as her becoming human.
Right. And there have been other situations where, like, I made one call one week and then came back later and was like, no, I actually think I made the wrong call on that. Now that I've given it a bit of thought, it should have been this other thing. But there were a lot of situations in this game where we would make one ruling about, like with Rory with taking harm when she sleeps with somebody, how that's represented, that we would later revisit and go, like, actually, it's really interesting if we go this other way with it. And I think that openness and ambiguity in the way the game rules are written actually really nicely feeds into the game, because you can always find something that works for the themes and tones of your game when you're resolving some kind of situation that happens.
Yeah, it means you need to have people who are willing to not rules lawyer and just go, yeah, this feels right for us in this moment.
If you're interested in rules lawyer,
this is
why are you playing story games?
Yeah,
like,
fair enough.
This is not. I can't imagine that this would be a fun game to rules lawyer. It's probably frankly too easy.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm getting to is, again, this is another thing where trust is important. If you can't trust each other to come back and say, look, we need to change that ruling and have people take that in the spirit in which it's meant, as opposed to, the GM's trying to screw me.
Yeah,
it's not going to work.
Yeah, that's true.
Yep. So yeah, I think that brings us to the end of our main discussion on Monsterhearts. So we're going to come back in just a second and talk about our inspirations for the game.
When I'm wide awake, if I fall, I fall. Calling, crawling, catch you, darling, when I'm wide awake. If I fall, I fall. And when I fall, I fall. Calling, crawling.
So welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit about inspirations that we had either in general or for Monsterhearts in particular, just to end off. I think I'm going to go first, and because mine this week, surprise, surprise, is not a book.
What?
I know, this is outrageous. It's never not a book.
What have you done with Megan?
She's fine somewhere else, totally. What?
It's fine. I've got a book I'll cover for her.
Cool.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so mine was, and this really just comes from the skin itself, but on the picture of the Infernal, the guy's wearing a hoodie. And for some reason, I really liked the hoodie, and so I wore one the first time we ever played, and then I made sure I was wearing one of my hoodies every time we played this game. Mostly it was the same one. And what became really interesting was what that meant for the character, because when she was feeling powerful, she actually always had the hood up. And there was one moment when I was trying to be really vulnerable and I pulled it down, and somebody on the couch beside me actually went, "Her hood just came down." And it was just really funny that it was a really simple item of clothing that somehow started to really symbolize whether or not my character felt powerful or not, and whether that meant she had a mask up, because to some degree when she felt powerful she had a bit of a mask up in a weird way when she had the hood up. So yeah, it was one of those moments again where I had sort of done it just on a lark and discovered that what it did for me physically always played into the character, and it always became a signal to all of you around the room, sort of how I was feeling in that moment and how I was approaching it. So yeah, my inspiration weirdly was a hoodie. What about you, Heather?
Well, I think a lot of people may be expecting, I think the group was expecting me to come in and say that my inspiration for being the last unicorn and the victim of dying magic would be to say that my inspiration was the last unicorn.
It isn't?
Which I've never seen. Which I am familiar with, but I've never watched the movie. I've never read really a unicorn story.
I think you may have actually have ended up in a better spot because of that, because you didn't in any way feel beholden to that subject matter.
Right. And I actually my sort of inspiration for kind of the feel of my character and the world my character came from was a late 90s TV movie about Merlin called Merlin it's from like 1998, and Sam Neill plays the character of Merlin, and I had it on VHS and I watched it all the time, and I loved the sort of kind of faux medieval world it was in and the sort of magic around the character, and I liked it so much I actually toyed with the idea of calling the unicorn Nimue, who's Merlin's sort of partner in the end. But I didn't think that worked very well. And I ended up just kind of taking that sort of sparkly magic undertone and kind of giving that to the unicorn character.
Very cool. Colin?
In a weird way, this is a game that I felt like really prepared for going in, because we never stopped talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer on this podcast.
Or watching it.
Or watching it. So
if you're me.
Well, but I also have 2 different rewatches on the go right now.
I have 3.
Yes, well.
Is this a bad time to say I've never seen it?
Okay, so rewatch
So
number
we have
4.
3 and 4 rewatches on the go.
Because I'm watching it by myself, and I'm watching it with Amanda, and I'm watching it with Heather. We could add I'm watching it with Melissa.
There we go.
Yeah, I'm watching it by myself, and I'm watching it with her and Amanda. But in a way that hasn't happened to me in a really long time. I didn't do a lot of research for this game. But the thing that really catalyzed me wanting to run this was the Kickstarter for Jackson Tegu's Second Skins coming out. When I was going through that, and when that came out, and reading the releases, and then getting the backers skins, that actually lit the fire under me to run the game.
And indeed, 2 of the characters were from the Second Skins, right? Both the Selkie and the Unicorn are not from the original book.
Just the Unicorn,
just the Unicorn,
is from the Second Skins. The Selkie is from a different set of skins.
Okay.
The Cuckoo, who we've talked about before on a previous podcast, is from that set. And the Neighbor, which I have played, is from that set. Mm-hmm. But there's an album I listened to over and over again while doing this game, which was Joel Plaskett's Ashtray Rock. which is about teenage love and fighting over relationships, and it's very teenager in that sort of like everything is unbelievably important way. Ultimately, that's a thing that really sort of shapes the way I think about the game.
So Buffy the Vampire Slayer, The Second Skins, and Joel Plaskett.
Yeah,
Nice.
I'm kind of a hog.
Yeah.
Well, I should actually say that I remember partway through the game posting on sort of our private message board that because there are sort of music inspirations in the book, but they're also a little bit older. And so partway through I was listening to Lord's Pure Heroine a lot, which I was unexpectedly a huge fan of and seemed to fit really well with the game and kind of the atmosphere. And so partway through I kind of linked to that.
So what about you, Melissa?
I'm going to break tradition and not talk about this game at all, because my inspiration for Gwen was basically the ocean. But a book that's been on my mind for kind of the last probably 2 months as something I want to see envisioned in a game in the future is The Magicians by Lev Grossman. And what it does really interestingly is it takes the idea of, it's kind of like Hogwarts and Narnia, but if like magic was no fun at all. It's soul-breaking drudgery. You spend hours and hours and hours memorizing hundreds of different small, minute details about the weather and where you are geographically and all this stuff. And at the end of it, what you get is these characters that are brilliant, but also so high-strung that they just break really easily. And they have lots of casual sex, and they drink a lot, and they do drugs, and it's this very strange kind of idea of being a wizard that I haven't seen before. The specialties that they have in this book are very specific. Like there's one girl, and her specialty is controlling light. But they use the actual term, like, I forget what it's called, but...
Like a photomancer or something?
Yeah, she's like a photomancer, and she's a brilliant photomancer, but you never hear about that. And this very specific kind of game. So it sounds like something that could make an amazing game.
You should run that game.
You would play it?
I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff you could do with that.
Yeah, so it's on my list, but it's a fantastic book that I definitely recommend.
Cool.
There's a little bit of triggering content in there, though, so be aware if you are considering it.
Good to know.
All right.
I was just going to ask before we close up, do either of you have anything you want to plug?
I'll do a shameless plug. So, like I said at the beginning, I'm a librarian by trade, and a group of me and 5 of my friends recently got together and we created a website called Reference This, and basically the idea is just ask us a question on anything, and we will give you the answer to it, and we'll cite it, and you'll be able to know for sure that this is the answer.
You use all the magic librarian powers you
We
acquired.
do. It's like going to the reference desk, except you don't have to leave your house. Yeah, definitely check it out. It's referencethis.ca. We're on Facebook and Twitter.
Cool.
Very cool. So roundup of our inspirations. Mine was my hoodie.
Mine was old TV movie, Merlin.
Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Jackson Tegu's Second Skins, and Joel Plaskett's Ashtray Rock.
Mine's The Magicians by Lev Grossman.
Great. Well, thank you very much for listening to this wrap party for Monsterhearts, and thank you, Colin, for running a game that we all had a lot of fun playing.
Oh, thank you for
It's
playing.
fantastic.
I think I enjoyed it just as much as you guys did. And to our listeners, I hope this wasn't too gamey a story for you. As always, when we record these things, that's something we worry about, and hopefully you enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Then I'll hold you.
Thanks for listening. For more Shake, Rattle, and Roleplay, drop by our Facebook page.
Softest pitch to the hardest break of dawn.
We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or ideas for stuff you'd like to hear on the show. Email us at shakerpg@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter @shakerpg.
With both my arms. If we mean love.
Music on our show was kindly provided by Little City, a great Canadian band you guys should totally check out. You can buy their album on iTunes or visit them online at littlecityband.com.
Mine. And practice calm and cool through troubled times. If I mean love, then I'll hold you up to the sky.
Cell keys are not funny at all.
Yeah.
No.
And they just don't understand the fundamental things that make jokes funny at
Yeah.
all.
And we actually now have a Twitter feed at Sulky Jokes.
What's big and blue and full of water?
What?
The ocean.
Hashtag selfie